My name is Veronica, and I work on behalf of the GIS Research Program, which is a project that is supporting the research being done here today. So this is a report launch for work that's being done on the global enabling environment for international financial flows. But the GIS Research Program has supported the work of scholars and academics that focus on corruption in a number of different sectors, in global context, in a number of different industries. So in the spring, please welcome in. In the spring, we wrapped up the first phase of research, which was focused on supporting the work of scholars that were looking at corruption, but not sort of in the abstract, really focusing on a problem in a specific context and working alongside practitioners and policymakers that would to inform really evidence-based policymaking. So we had great projects that worked alongside multilateral institutions, partner governments, and a lot of civil society in order to get some uptake and implementation of their key research findings. In this new phase of the research, we commissioned 3 reports on corruption risks in the commodities trading sector, in global enabling environment for illicit financial flows, and also vulnerabilities in a crisis and emergency context, corruption vulnerabilities. And we have 3 new reports that we're going to be launching in similar ways as we are today. So today we have this report. Next week in London, in case anyone here is happening to hop on a plane, we're going to do another similar event for a report on the global trade and corruption risks in the commodities industry. And there's going to be a hybrid option as well. So feel free to join us either in person or virtually. With that, I'm going to let Lakshmi, our moderator, take it away. Thank you all for joining.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the report launch for Curbing IFS and the Enablers of Corruption. I'm Lakshmi Kumar, the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity. Hop, skip, and a jump, not very far away from here. But it is a great privilege to have 3 authors with us today. Noah Arshinoff and Jane Humphreys. Noah is the founder and managing director of Oct International Consulting. He's also an adjunct professor of anti-corruption law at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Oct International is a legal and policy consulting firm that specializes in anti-corruption matters. Noah brings over a decade of diverse experience in the field. He has successfully advocated for amendments to various pieces of legislation and policy in Canada and beyond, ranging from the implementation of remediation agreements to whether lawyers should be reporting entities under state regulation for the purposes of anti-money laundering. At the international level, Noah has worked to strengthen whistleblower infrastructure in Africa, promote transparency in supply chains in the European Union and Canada, and delivered courses to prosecutors on how to detect and adequately sanction corruption offenses. Our second author that we have here today, Jane Humphreys, is also with Oct International Consulting. She's a senior associate there. She's also the founder of Beyond Borders Policy Consulting in Canada. She brings with us here today more than 15 years of public and private sector leadership experience related to international financial services, border security, and trade policy. Having worked for more than a decade at the US State Department in Canada, she now researches, monitors, and advises on international regulatory matters and devises actionable strategy frameworks. Before moving to Canada, Jane was a senior analyst at the US Federal Reserve in New York, where she researched and reported on financial services regulatory concerns. And the last author, Mark Tasse, unfortunately couldn't be with us here today, but he's a forensic accountant and a professor at the Telfer Business School and Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. For over 30 years, he has specialized in the fight against transnational financial crime with expertise in prevention and detection of fraud, corruption, and money laundering. So, clearly between the 3 of you, I think we quickly add up to about a century worth of experience there, just fighting anti-corruption and money laundering. So this is a great privilege to be able to talk about the report. I think it's coming at an incredibly valuable and important juncture with the Russian invasion And I think this would be very valuable for a lot of us that are interested in better understanding the issue of enablers. And, let me start off with the rather obvious question of, why enablers? What are enablers and why is this a relevant and important topic when we talk about illicit financial flows? No, I didn't know if you wanted to sort of, talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Just to start off, so enablers are essentially those professional service providers that aid and abet criminals, essentially, to hide and move their wealth or to obscure their wealth. And the reason that they're important is because in order to get money out of certain jurisdictions into other jurisdictions, you really need these service providers. There's not really other ways to do it. So at some point in that movement of illicit financial funds, they're required. So the other element is that the enablers tend to be located in countries in the global north. Countries with safe institutions, strong rule of law, and with the release of all the various leaks that have happened in the past few years, the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, and all that kind of thing, it started to look a bit embarrassing for countries in the global north. I know that's true for my home jurisdiction in Canada, in the sense that we're helping all these kind of kleptocrats and people move funds out of regions that need those funds into our institutions, where their identities are kept secret, and I think that's a big problem. Just to give a very brief overview of the research of the report and what we touched on with enablers, we really tried to look at the state of evidence that exists for how enablers are involved in illicit financial flows. So there's been a lot of talk and a lot of articles that have been written about enablers. What we generally found, though, is that there's less evidence, concrete evidence, that shows their direct involvement and how the whole thing works. So we kind of looked at the state of play of what exists and tried to bring that into kind of one report and make a few recommendations on what further research is needed.
No, there's one thing I want to pick up on when you said that a lot of these enabler professions are concentrated in the global north. And, that brings me to the fact that, yes, they're concentrated in the global north, yet we have had regulation on the books for years, but somehow we feel like there's real momentum around this issue. So Jane, I don't know if you could speak to a little bit more why in this moment.
Yeah, well, you're right. This really is, in some ways, maybe a tipping point. There's certainly a lot of momentum and activity around the globe. I think part of this reason for this is, some of the data leaks and analysis that have come out recently, the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers. It's really shone a light on what has been happening. It's not that it's necessarily this brand new thing, but it's and probably not a secret to many of you in this room, but it is new to a lot of people just how widespread this is. We're talking about upwards of trillions of dollars in illicit financial flows, and obviously the war earlier in Russia, and this is really enabling that type of activity and corruption that by using the resources and services north, other countries can engage in these activities.
No, that's great. And, I want to sort of piggyback to what Noah was talking about earlier about, the need for evidence. And, when we start talking about the heart of what enablers look like, we talk about real estate, accountants, lawyers, those are the big three in everyone's mind now. The attention, especially with real estate, the renewed attention on real estate agents and accountants is relatively recent. And so what can you sort of really tell us based on your research in the report about what the regulatory landscape really looks like and what are the challenges around regulating, especially these two classes of enablers?
Yeah, as you say, important that the scope of who is involved is our understanding is growing, and it's also I just want to point out your last question about why now. What we're starting to see how broad the scope is, and that it impacts. This is not victimless crime or something that just impacts some people in faraway countries. This also impacts us on, in terms of real estate prices, in terms of the corruption in institutions like educational institutions. So this is something that needs to be communicated clearly, just how widespread these impacts are. But to get to more specifically, in terms of accountants, this is a group that probably only about a third internationally, according to the governing international body, are professional accountants and therefore under any type of regulation at all. So fully 2/3 are really not coming under any regulation. So this was something that was really striking to us in the research. And AML is really only part of their education or training as sort of on the job and not part of the curriculum for the most part. So this is an area where clearly a lot more needs to be done. In terms of real estate agents, again, there's this is an opportunity in places like London, as we've seen, LA, Vancouver, New York City, very large dollar transactions and an opportunity to anonymously funnel large sums of money through, and it's really set up to provide a lot of anonymity for the purchaser. So you get, for example, examples in Canada and Vancouver of students coming in, paying millions of dollars in cash, plopping it down, buying up housing, and then this contributes to skyrocketing housing prices.
Jean, especially when you start talking about accountants, the big four accounting firms have all been featured in money laundering scandals. None of them have escaped scrutiny. Has there been regulation to go after them in any of the countries, that you looked at? Has there been implementation? If you could, help us understand a little bit more about, where has regulation gone with accountants? Because with real estate agents, I'm familiar with, what the EU is doing in a couple of other countries, but I think with accountants, is there anything, where is it going? How is it going? And how did you, and I suppose the next question in that, I suppose, is what about the 1/3 that you said don't qualify? Should they also qualify as professional accountants? Should they also be regulated?
Yeah. So it's 2/3 that are engaged in activities that really are not regulated because they're considered non-professional.
Okay.
As it really, the accounts are really regulated at the level of the service that they provide for the most part. But as you say, the big firms, there are, it depends on the country. It depends, all of these things are really at jurisdictional level. And so you get a patchwork around the world and countries, US treats accountants very differently from parts of the EU or Canada. So sometimes there are regulations or if we're talking about bankers, obviously they're very highly regulated, and yet even after decades of regulation, we see that through the data leaks that there's significant involvement.
No, thank you so much. And then we come to our favorite thorny issue when it comes to enablers, which is the subject of lawyers. There is a lot of dialogue around the challenges in including lawyers, especially within the fold of AML regulation. And it would be great if you could talk us through what do those challenges specifically look like. And the elephant in the room is attorney-client privilege, but how have countries successfully navigated that? Just your thoughts on what it looks like regulation in this space.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start off with an example, which is to take you into a little journey through Canada for a moment. So this issue of whether or not lawyers should be reporting entities for the Financial Intelligence Unit in Canada was a big thing for about 10 years. Basically, the state wanted to bring lawyers into the fold. Lawyers really didn't want to come into the fold, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled on the side of the lawyers and said, no, you can't make lawyers agents of the state. I mean, those weren't the exact words of the judges, but essentially that's what it meant, is that you can't make lawyers agents of the state because you would undermine the independence of the legal profession and the ability for lawyers to provide adequate advice to their clients. The other part of that decision was that they recognized the role of self-regulation. So lawyers at least in Canada, and I think most jurisdictions in the US, if not every jurisdiction in the US, are self-regulated by either a bar association or a law society. And the reporting that they have to do to those law societies would basically have been copied for what they would have had to provide to the Financial Intelligence Unit. And the Supreme Court had said, there's no real purpose to this. Lawyers are already doing this. They're already reporting suspicious activity on their clients. It's just that they're reporting it to the independent self-regulatory authority rather than to a body controlled by the state. So the state lost. I don't know if AML lost. It's a bit of a question up in the air, but one of the challenges is exactly that, is how do you overcome this issue of self-regulation? And so in the legal profession, it's just one profession, but there's one of the things we found in going through our research was that there hasn't been much discussion, if any, on whether or not self-regulation was effective at thwarting that a profession like lawyers being involved in money laundering. So there isn't any comparison to show in one jurisdiction where lawyers might be regulated by the state versus another jurisdiction where they might be self-regulated, if there are any differences or weaknesses from one model to another. So that's something that we kind of recommend should be further looked at. And the other challenge going to the jurisdictions is in a lot of places, lawyers, same with accountants, are regulated at the national level. So in countries that are not federations such as Canada and the US, but in North America, at least, they're regulated at the subnational level. So, so in Canada, that means we have 13 law societies that regulate lawyers. In the US, it's even more complicated than that. And so, you know, that in itself poses another challenge because we have 13 independent regulators with then kind of an association on top of that, of those 13 regulators, so they can attempt to all have similar rules in place, but they don't necessarily have all the exact same rules in place.
I will say, you know, I will take moderator's prerogative here to spend a little more time on the issue of lawyers, because I think it is fascinating to everyone, and no matter where I travel in the world, it's the question that always comes up. It is the most contentious of questions. And so, you know, just as a counterpoint, you know, the European Court of Justice, the same thing went up before the European Court of Justice, similar to the Canadian Supreme Court. And there, the European Court of Justice held that lawyers should be subject to AML requirements as long as it was not in an adversarial relationship. So it's only when you're defending a client in court that you really invoke the attorney-client privilege. When you're purely acting in an advisory capacity, or as you know, international standards require, FATF standards require, when a lawyer is setting up a real estate transaction, those don't immediately prejudice that attorney-client privilege, and that's where the opportunity lies. And so, you know, is that the path forward then? Is the rationale of the European Court of Justice something countries can emulate, or something where the opportunity for regulation, especially lawyers, would lie?
Yeah, well, I think that's where different jurisdictions treat this issue very differently, because the concept of privilege in Canada is very different than what it is in continental Europe. Yeah. And so just to give you an example, this is not totally off topic, but in-house lawyers in Canada, and I'm pretty sure the US is the same, also benefit from attorney-client privilege.
Yeah.
Okay, which was not the case really for in-house counsel working in continental Europe.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So just that the very concept of privilege itself is defined very differently in those jurisdictions. It's a challenge that would have to be overcome based on how the Supreme Court in Canada has ruled on privilege. I don't think there'd be that flexibility, at least in Canada, to follow or emulate what has happened in Europe. It may be one of the differences, you know, between you know, common law jurisdictions versus civil law jurisdictions in the way that some of these principles are imagined.
UK is a common law jurisdiction. They do have requirements.
Yeah, the UK
is a common, where Canada also takes its inspiration of legislation from
Yeah,
The UK does require for all non-adversarial relationships, attorney-client to require you to provide, and I think several other common law jurisdictions across the African continent,
Yeah.
South Asia, East Asia, all common law
Yeah.
jurisdictions, you know. Colonial legacy sometimes does have its advantage.
This is also one of the areas we point to in our recommendations, was really understanding what, what's working
Mhm.
and where, and how to better frame regulations going forward, where there is flexibility and it's not constitutional. So this really is not just with lawyers, but is it self-regulation within the profession? Is it the state? How much of a role should there be international oversight? So this is something we did focus on quite a lot, but I think it just points to the need for more evidence on what's working.
And I think both of you know, and Jim, both of you raised a really interesting point about self-regulation versus regulation by a state authority. And I was curious, in self-regulation, from what your research has shown, especially with, whether it's lawyers or accountants, is there that, because with state supervision, what happens is there is a function of supervision that takes place. So you're going for checks. When a bank is required under the BSA in the US to file SARS or have AML compliance, you have someone going and checking to see. So is that part and parcel of self-regulation? Is that model in place in any of the countries you looked at?
I'll take a quick crack at it then. So there is oversight with self-regulation. I mean, I'll just speak from, I am a lawyer, so that is my background, but the law societies, at least in Canada, do have oversight on legal activities. So, if you look at the codes of conduct that you have to abide by, they're pretty extensive. It's not like you have kind of carte blanche to just go out and provide legal services and that's that. It is quite extensive. I think there is one element though with state oversight that I think gets overlooked in the sense that regulation sometimes gets put in place. But what happens is that the entities that have to abide by that regulation do so more as a form of compliance than necessarily as a form of trying to weed out criminals.
Okay.
And I think what we've seen with banks, at least what we uncovered with banks, is that, there's a ton of regulation that they have to abide by, but often it's done with that view to form over function. So compliance instead of let's actually find out who the criminal actors are, because over and over again, the same banks, they keep reporting on the same client, yet keep accepting the same client's money as one of their clients. So does it work or does it not work?
Jane, I don't know if you had something else to add to this issue of.
No, really just I think Noah covered it quite well, particularly with the bankers and lawyers in terms of the accountants. Again, it depends on the jurisdiction. There's often some sort of a code of conduct or so it's really a patchwork, but where these policies are most effective is something that we, and how they're implemented and what that means is something that we still need a lot more work.
No, that's, and I think that's what we're here to understand is where the gaps lie, what the way forward is. I will say as a former regulator myself, I am deeply opposed to self-regulation from the very core of my being. I'm opposed to self-regulation. All about trying to find ways to regulate people because I truly believe that is the way forward. But no, this has been fantastic. And I want to sort of go on to sort of another theme and then, maybe sort of throw it to our audience and have them feed in as well. The one thing is, as you said, this report shows where the gaps lie, and you raise a lot of very important questions. And, even within that space, I'd be interested to understand, Noah, if there was something that you looked at and said, this is an interesting idea, this is an interesting way to go about regulation. This is something that, other countries could look at. Is there for a particular class of enabler or a particular country experience that stood out when you were doing research?
Yeah, one of the policies that we looked at in a fair bit of depth is beneficial ownership transparency. which is kind of a hot topic at the moment. Lots of jurisdictions are talking about implementing it or fixing what they've already implemented. And one thing we uncovered was that in a lot of jurisdictions, again, they were concerned with form over function at the beginning. So, for example, the UK has been heavily criticized for, they put this thing together, but it really looks like it was kind of slapped together and the quality of the data can't be very well relied upon. But then we came across Slovakia, and in Slovakia, it was done very differently. Slovakia's example was that it requires an authorized person to verify the identity of the beneficial owner, and that authorized person can be, for example, a lawyer, an accountant, a banker, etc. So basically, different classes of enablers, and it shifts the liability onto that enabler to maintain that information, to ensure its accuracy, and it gives them the accountability so that they can't really just file it and walk away. Any false or misleading information comes back to the enabler who was the authorized person on that, and there are penalties that are involved if there's any misleading information. So Slovakia's example of how they implemented beneficial ownership transparency seems quite unique and quite different than what other places have done, and they made sure that a professional that has helped incorporate that vehicle maintains responsibility for it.
So that's fascinating to understand as a best case practice for how beneficial ownership is structured. And if I'm reading between the lines here, not to put you on the spot, Noah, that you didn't actually, there was nothing that really stood out in terms of how the enabler classes were actually well regulated.
Truthfully, there wasn't any real evidence in terms of like looking at lawyers or accountants or like any one particular thing that was, the needle in the haystack.
Oh, because I remember, if I'm not mistaken, I thought, if I remember your report correctly, casinos was something that you talked about as having more sort of a positive aspect to how the regulations were done, right?
Yeah, do you want to?
Go ahead. It's a small case study, kind of. So, but yeah.
So the casinos was really limited to British Columbia,
Okay.
in Canada. It was so small jurisdiction, at least in a global sense, and they basically just changed the reporting requirements on casinos. And what they found was that once they made that change, I think the suspicious activity reports were reduced by about 90%. Partly because I guess the casinos had to do a lot more checks on where the money was coming from. So I mean, it's a small example. I don't know if we can copy it on a global scale. I think we probably have to look at it a little closer.
Which is part of the challenge of, the context is so important for a lot of these regulations, whether you're talking about, what kind of resources does a country have for enforcement. So, there is necessarily going, an element of this being quite piecemeal internationally, but I think that there are also opportunities at a larger international scale to make some progress on things like beneficial ownership transparency and ways that, some of these corrupt people who are, doing the money laundering in the first place, they have the resources, they can be flexible in terms of where they take their money, like a whack-a-mole thing, so being able to enlist a broader international set of tools to some of these issues is really important.
Jay, I had a question really, listening to what Noah is saying. When we talk about learning from experiences and what we can implement, it's always to our benefit to learn from experiences that have worked well, but it is also equally to our benefit to learn from experiences that have gone terribly wrong. And so was there anything in your research, again, looking at the different models of regulation, looking at different countries that stood out as something, for all of us in the room, for an audience that is interested in the issue, something that should not be done, that really has not worked for a country?
Well, I would really have to go back to the suspicious activity report. So we talked about which have come to be seen as almost a get out of jail free card, because, you submit the form and you're covered. And it puts the onus for oversight on somebody else. And right now, there are so many of these that they're not even being looked at. They're not even being evaluated. So it's a way, the way it has been implemented has ended up having these unintended consequences. And that's in the banking sector in particular. There are other areas where they're really underutilized. So it's not always just the individual policy, it's how it's implemented and what the context is where it's working or not working. If we have another example.
Can I just add to
Yeah.
the SAR issue? Just to be a little, not to be too confrontational about it, but no, but I think, that idea of policy implementation, if the policy results in a stack of papers that are unlooked at, it's not effective.
Yeah.
And so that's the case. And I think what a lot of, potentially what a lot of enabler classes, such as like bankers, for example, the get out of jail free aspect is that it becomes a cover your ass thing, right? You've submitted the suspicious activity report. It's off your desk. It's someone else's problem, but it just sits there because the bureaucrats aren't resourced well enough to actually go through the thousands of reports that get to them. And I think that's just to tie that back into that Slovakia example. I think that's why that example is so interesting and a different topic, but that liability doesn't get shifted onto somebody else. It stays, it's always there.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think there is statistics to show that only 0.2% of all money that's laundered is actually seized. And that really goes to the heart of efficacy of the SAR reporting. I know there's another topic we wanted to do before the break, but I thought, we've touched on some really interesting areas. I think it would be great to open it up to the audience. The one thing I just wanted to add before we do, as someone that also works in the US on a lot of US advocacy efforts, I do want to mention that, in the US, at least for lawyers, as far as, the ABA rules are concerned, the guidelines do say that you aren't allowed to just take on a client and not know and, essentially participate in an illegal activity. So the notion that would be in breach of attorney-client privilege, especially in an advisory capacity, is something that the rules, the functioning rules of the ABA work very hard to make carve out so that you can't engage in something illicit. But I also know that I have a lot of colleagues here that are working on the issue that can talk about it as well. So I want to just open it up to the audience for questions and for, not to call out folks from the PACT Coalition or TI, but, to talk a little bit more about sort of the thinking in the US, especially on the subject of attorneys. But yeah, questions, it would be great to have some questions from the audience. I don't know if we can get questions from
We
those.
have some online, actually. Lakshmi, hi, this is Isabella, Global Integrity. I have Scott Graytack who raised his hand, and then I have one in the chat for you that I'll read out.
Okay, great. Scott, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you can go ahead and ask.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for having this event. Really, really good to see the report. I'm sure folks are aware in the US, there's a big coalition effort. Every major anti-corruption organization that works on foreign corruption basically is supporting a bill called the Enablers Act that the House of Representatives passed a couple months ago. It's now moving through the Senate. And it would do many of these things by giving Treasury the authority to require different anti-money laundering safeguards based on risk to folks like lawyers, accountants. Of course, it does it based on services. It doesn't regulate lawyers. It says if you form a company, if you form a trust, that's how it goes about it. But I think the discussion here is important to make clear that the US Supreme Court, based on the US Constitution, has said that the Bank Secrecy Act, including the requirement to file SARs, is 100% constitutional. And that's, in Canada, and unfortunately, the Canadian Supreme Court based on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which we obviously don't have here, found that that requirement on lawyers was unconstitutional. Our Supreme Court reached the exact opposite decision. And it kind of reminds me of the pros and cons of comparing law, because the Canadian Supreme Court has also said in another anti-corruption context that you can restrict, political spending by corporations, which I thought was a phenomenal decision from about 20 years ago. And of course, our Supreme Court in Citizens United said that corporations can spend as much money as they want. Again, looking at different bodies of law. So they just want to surface that we don't see any constitutional issues whatsoever in what the Enablers Act would do. When Congress speaks on this issue, all of the states have to abide by it. So again, just wanted to chime in there and really appreciate the discussion and the research that the report is focusing on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Scott. Isabella, you mentioned there were a couple of others that had questions.
Yes, I have Dennis Munir, who is asking or commenting that in his experience, most laws are not effective as self-regulating their members for money laundering. And as self-regulators, they are not truly independent or transparent to the public on the results of their audits, the number of audits, and their enforcement actions against their own members. So the question is, how has your research looked into these aspects?
Noah, Jane,
Thank you, Denis, for the question. You put me on the spot here. Yeah, so the answer to that question is, truthfully, we didn't go into primary research about whether or not all the self-regulatory professions were done right. The recommendation in this research is that research should be done.
Okay.
We should do it. It is a requirement in order to devise adequate policy solutions to deal with the problem. This report that we did was really to gather kind of the state of evidence of what's been written and what's been researched so far. But we recognize there's a lot of gaps, and I think Denis nailed it. I think that is absolutely one of the gaps that needs to be looked at in terms of self-regulation, so that we can decide, is self-regulation adequate or not, and then maybe we can then move it forward from there.
And that's a fair point. I think, despite what Denis and I share as an opinion, that's a fair point for research. I will admit to that. Jane, I didn't know if you also had something to add to that.
Not really. More the first comment really just also makes me reflect on the resourcing for some of these.
Yes.
That it's one thing to have oversight, to bring more of these enablers into the body of oversight and more consistent with the FATF guidelines, but then there's, how is that actually implemented? How is that enforced? Are the resources there? FinCEN directors recently publicly talked about how there aren't enough resources even right now. So it's just another piece of the bigger picture.
Again, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but we have a FinCEN resourcing person expert in our midst. I don't want to call it Eric rounding back coalition. But it would be great if you could sort of maybe add a little bit more information on sort of the need for resourcing, what resourcing looks like, and maybe what people in the US should be thinking about, because I think that could be valuable for people in other parts of the world who are also trying to think about how to do regulation but run up against the resourcing issue.
Well, you didn't put me on the spot because I was going to raise my hand anyway. So this works out for everyone. No, thanks for that. And thank you again for this report and this opportunity. I think, just to zoom out for a second, I think the question that we're talking about right now really is about, there's this question of holding enablers that are already going to work with, bad guys accountable, putting them on the hook for having to have these requirements, giving law enforcement another angle at making sure that they're held to account, that they're responsible for knowing who they're working with. But this other element that we're talking about is this public-private partnership. How we make sure that the folks that are providing this information can actually give information to law enforcement, and that law enforcement can actually digest this information effectively and provide feedback loops to those private actors to make sure that the information is actually being useful for investigations. And this point on FinCEN funding is so important, and broader FIU funding, financial intelligence unit funding. Because as you rightly mentioned, you can't do that if you don't have the resources to actually digest all that information. Especially if it's, someone manually sitting behind a desk, looking through all those SARs, or even on the automated side, making sure that there's modern tools to be able to review something like 2 million SARs or something that gets sent to at least the US FIU every year. And so we've been having a lot of conversations with Congress about how to better resource the US Financial Intelligence Unit. Right now, the US Financial Intelligence Unit, FinCEN, has $161 million for its base budget. The administration has requested a 31% increase to that budget. Still puts us behind, I think, international standards about how US, how a financial intelligence unit should be resourced. For those in this room or online that haven't looked at it yet, Transparency International has a great report called Up to the Task that actually does a comparative analysis of FIU funding. And just one example from that, we're talking about looking at suspicious activity reports. The German FIU, I think, has about 500 suspicious activity reports for every one person on staff. The US, it's 10,000 per person. So just to show the scale of the problem, and you were mentioning the UK earlier, there's been massive cuts to the National Crime Agency. Again, the US, we need to really step up to the plate. And so anyway, I've taken more time than I should, but completely agree with what you guys are talking about, and hope we can keep moving forward on this issue.
No, thank you so much, Erica. And I just wanted to see Isabella, if there were other questions or comments, or there were other questions from the audience that we have with us here in person for our, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of questions.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Corinne Turvis. I'm with the Data Foundation, and my question is about data. You've talked a little bit about the value of data leaks in rooting out some of this thing, and even touched on the quality of data. When we think about the mechanisms for improving regulation, even for improving staff capacity and all of these, we run into consistent challenges with data standardization, with data sharing. And I'm wondering, as you think about expanding the umbrella of regulation to these sort of enablers, does that not, how do you solve that data standardization problem? How do you get an effective standardized reporting mechanism for such varying industries?
That's a great question. And we saw in some of our research, even jurisdictions where they would scale down the amount of data, the categories of data they collected in order to try to get better data in at least a few areas, even if they couldn't be as broad as possible. So I think, it's just another example where the context is so important, the resourcing is so important. I think having leadership from countries that are in a position to, put forward their best cases and provide some of the tools, hopefully, to move forward. But I don't have an answer for you, just to acknowledge that it is a real challenge.
This might segue into a question I want to ask later, but it might be a right time to answer, because the data problem goes beyond, you're absolutely correct. I think that is absolutely an issue. But one of the things we found as well is when people like to talk about enablers very generally, right? We sort them into these categories of lawyers and accountants and bankers and so and so. But we don't really have data on the extent of how many lawyers really are involved in IFFs, how many accountants. I think we've gone beyond the kind of bad apples argument, but we don't really have the data on, at what point do lawyers and accountants turn away clients? Should that happen more often? Do they need to do more due diligence on their clients? Like, that stuff is missing from the analysis of how bad are the enablers, right? And so, not to defend, well, I will defend the professions a little bit, but no, but I think it's true. Like, we have to recognize that, we shouldn't just be painting these professions as kind of, evil enablers of international illicit financial flows. I think, but we need that data to understand where within those professions are those really problematic points. I don't know if we have sufficient research yet to hone in on that.
Ian, please go ahead.
Hi, Ian Gary from the FACT Coalition. Just to jump on that issue, it seems like it's the nature of the problem that we don't have the data. I mean, we're talking about financial secrecy and illicit financial flows. So in some sense, as an advocate, I would think that this kind of quest for data that is going to be very hard to get is kind of a way to delay getting regulation. So could you talk about, like, if you had the resources to do the research, what methodology would you use to get the data to fill the gaps that you're identifying?
To be honest, I would actually start at the regulation side of things. I think I think you're right. You can end up in kind of the wormhole of searching and searching and searching and never finding anything. But I think doing the regulation comparison, see if anything comes out of that first, and then moving on. So, for example, if you could identify a jurisdiction, let's say, where self-regulation clearly wasn't working in there, and there seems to be a higher level of involvement of lawyers in illicit financial flows in that particular jurisdiction because of the way regulation was structured, you might be able to kind of, as a next step, dig a bit deeper into that. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just focusing on data of how many lawyers are involved has the potential to just delay it. But the only other thing I will say about it is that so international organizations such as the International Bar Association, the International Federation of Accountants, I mean, they're cognizant of this too, right? And they have done significant work on anti-corruption and anti-money laundering and trying to ensure that they draw a perimeter around the profession so that lawyers don't get involved in this kind of stuff. But nothing's bulletproof, of course. So there are loopholes that get found. Anyway, that's maybe another topic, but yeah.
No, Ian, do you have something else?
No, I was just going to say that it seems like we would have to wait for the next Panama Papers or Pandora Papers to come out around a specific jurisdiction to know that self-regulation isn't working, unless there are other ways to measure the efficacy of that.
I do have thoughts myself, but I'll make sure the audience actually has a chance to. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'm John Abbott from Christian Group. I'm more interested in the technology side. To what degree did you include digital activities or digital services into your research as it pertains to data? Because, like she said, the quality of the data at the starting point is very important, knowing that people do measurement to allow them to build algorithms like AI, machine learning, and all that, which are all part of the infrastructure flow of financial intelligence. How much of that did you include in your research?
Honestly, not that much. I mean, except to identify that these are promising areas. I think there is place for AI and and blockchain to be able to mechanize some of this work that and that's where I think, again, having some international collaboration is going to be important. We just it's some of our research and interviews. It seems like it's still just very early days, but I think very, very promising. I don't have anything more specific.
The only thing I'll add about AI, so again, the research was looking at kind of the state of what exists. So to what extent has technology been used to look at this issue of enablers and illicit financial flows? And AI has been touted as the solution for a decade now, but has it arrived yet? Like that, I mean, that's kind of what we found, is there's been talk about it for a long time, but there hasn't really been anything that shows the results of AI. So does that mean it hasn't been used adequately? Like that, not totally sure. That's kind of where we landed on the technology issue.
Just last chance if there's anyone else with a question, either online or in person. If I wanted to get our, both our authors to talk about recommendations. Is there anyone else, Isabella, online?
No, no further questions. Just a comment from Barbara Keller that FinCEN resourcing is even worse than that and does a lot more than most FIUs. So that's her comment. If there's anyone else would like to chime in, please do now. And back to you, Lakshmi. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I do have one comment just to follow up on the discussion that Ian and Noah were having, which is that, very often when you talk, I consider myself a former regulator, a lawyer who dabbles in data. And that's really sort of where I live. And what I will say is that, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem where you often tell people that, oh, there's no evidence, so you can't do wrongdoing. But the only way you can actually find wrongdoing is if you supervise these entities, if you're actually going into their offices, if they are required to file SARS, if they're required to file. Otherwise, Vincent just can't walk into a white shoe law firm and say, show me your client. You have to create mechanisms, and therefore you are creating a chicken and egg situation by telling advocates and telling people, no, unless you prove evidence, we will not regulate this entity. I think another way to think about this is when we started regulating the banking sector, the US is one of the first countries to do it in the 1980s. No other country in the world had done it at that point. And what you saw then was, look at how much money is flowing through these types of entities, through these types of institutions. So if we are looking for an opportunity to catch illicit money, then you have to target institutions that have access to that information or help facilitate it. It doesn't matter if they're doing it purposefully or not purposefully, but money flows through those institutions, and therefore we have to target them. And that is often where the logic should be with enablers, is that the banks don't have access to all kinds of information, but lawyers or an estate agent or accountant may do. And it's not because they are purposefully doing something illegal, but they are the ones that are the proximate relationship to that illicit activity. And that's why you are looking to them to do it. Yes, in some cases they're willfully, cooperating, but it's because they have that relationship, they are able to provide information. And I think the way we think about this is also important, because otherwise we quickly get trapped in that chicken and egg logic. And I just wanted to sort of, for the benefit of everyone, just to put that out. But again, I know we're running short on time, and
I also just want to say that it's really not an either or, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that we think that we should just sit back and do more research and nothing else. So this is really, I think, multi-pronged. There are regulations out there. There's more happening. There are some positive things happening, I think, in a lot of different areas. So it's not, I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we're just saying, just study this more.
No, and I know, but I think it's important, like you said, if we are truly trying to improve the way things work, as you said, we need to know the gaps, because when you know the gaps, that's when you're able to. And it's important to understand, because if someone comes up and says, hey, why haven't you explored self-regulation as an option? You should be able to say, you know what, it doesn't work. And so, I think it's always valuable to understand where the gaps lie. But with that, I think it is a perfect segue into what we're talking about, which is, because this report raises so many valuable questions and future avenues for research, what are your recommendations from there about, things that we should be cognizant of, where what future research should take place, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one of the first things is that we need to evaluate the effectiveness of current tools. Jane and I were looking at, transparency registries to see, is there evidence that shows that after implementation of these registries, there's been a marked decrease in illicit financial flows through that particular jurisdiction. We don't really have that data yet. Be digging on data more, but I think knowing that will then enable us to better direct those types of registries. And I know, Canada's talking about implementing a registry now. I would hope that when it gets implemented, we have some data from the UK, from Slovakia, from the other places that say these are the key elements that need to be part of it to actually show a true marked decrease in the activity that we're trying to prevent. Otherwise, it's just another registry.
and having that feedback loop and having it be an iterative process and that it will continue to develop as we understand better. So we do need to move forward with these regulations in order to study them, see what's working, see what's not working.
Before we conclude, your top 2 thoughts that our audience should take away about the report, that they should keep in mind about why this is a valuable report to look at, learn from. Some top two or three things that they will take away when they read this report or recommendations that you have. And I do have one last question, but I will say that, which is, I think, we have an audience here, both online and in person, who engage with this issue differently. And I think one of the things that we often struggle with is to tell people why this impacts the everyday citizen. And I think that's an important function of no matter what kind of work you do, whether it's in data policy. And so, maybe your top 2 things, and if you could, talking about, how does this impact the everyday citizen? And if you could leave us with that, that would be fantastic.
Well, maybe I'll start with that last point. This, and I touched on it a little bit earlier, but this really is critical. And I think it can be easy to get lost in really big numbers or, governments far away or, 600 pages of regulation, but we're talking about, communities, countries that are having their resources stripped from them and siphoned off to somewhere else or to their leaders. We're talking about the way that crime is able to perpetuate itself, and how these people are able to take the money that they gain and continue it and build on that. We're talking about neighborhood issues. We're talking about universities and academic institutions that are used as a way to launder reputations for criminals. Or bring family members in. We're talking, and into the fold and into legitimate circles. We're talking about housing down the street. Can you afford a place? So these are very real issues that impact us directly. When just thinking about it in these broad terms of corruption and IFFs and so on, it's hard to relate our trillions of dollars, but these really do mean something to us, and this is something that we need to pay attention to.
No, thank you so much. Before we hand off, no, I just don't know if you had any other thoughts about the report that you wanted to leave the audience itself with.
It's big and complicated, but I think there are some real opportunities, and the fact that there is so much attention on this issue right now is really encouraging, and we need to build on that momentum. So I would take away actually quite a positive note from this, that yes, it's a really big problem. It's very fractured in terms of how policies are implemented, but I think sometimes by necessity. And that through ongoing work by some people in this room, I'm sure we are making some headway.
Thank you so much, Jane. Noah, your final thoughts.
I'll be short, but the closing thought is I think the issue of enablers is overwhelmingly massive. It's huge. It's a gargantuan task to go after so many different professions at once. To try and solve an issue that's in the trillions and trillions of dollars worldwide. So I think where policy tends to have success is when we can target and when we can prioritize. And I think a little bit more thinking on that is probably required. I mean, we didn't talk about art dealers today, but part of that was intentional because when we looked at it, we thought, should we really focus so much on art dealers when maybe only 10% of the art market is the market that's ripe for abuse? Maybe we just leave that aside for now and focus on some of the bigger issues and try and get a few wins. So maybe it's that, few baby steps in a row make a big difference over time.
No, thank you again, Noah and Jane, and Mark was not here for this report. I think everyone look forward to reading it. Thank you to everyone that's there here in person today, everyone that joined us online. I believe there are very tasty snacks somewhere outside. I have that in my notes, and I promised I wouldn't read it out because there was samosas, etc., written there. So, thank you again, and it was lovely to have everyone as an audience. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.